Dawn, April 18, 1943. The humid air above Henderson Field trembled with the roar of engines. 18 American pilots climbed into their cockpits, unaware that in just a few hours they would carve their names into history. They had been told nothing, no target, no reason, only coordinates that led straight into enemy skies. Each man looked at the horizon, whispering his own silent prayer. Some thought of mothers, some of sweethearts, some of the brothers who had never come home from Pearl Harbor. None of them knew the truth, that they were flying to hunt the very man who had brought America to war. Before the sun set, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto would be dead, and the balance of World War II would begin to shift forever. Stay with us, because this is not just another tale of vengeance. It's a story of intellect, courage, and the human cost of duty on both sides of the Pacific. By the spring of 1943, the war in the Pacific had reached a tense crossroads. Japan's empire still stretched from Burma to the Solomons, but its early glory was fading. The stunning triumph at Pearl Harbor had awakened a giant. Factories across America thundered day and night, turning steel and sweat into weapons that could reach across oceans. Yet every victory came with sacrifice. On the battered runways of Guadalcanal, young men prepared to risk everything to end a war none of them had started. In the background, intelligence officers hunched over decoded messages, tracing a single itinerary, the flight plan of Admiral Yamamoto himself. The man who once studied at Harvard, who had warned his own leaders that war with the United States would be suicide, was now about to face that prophecy in the most personal way possible. Inside a dimly lit room in Pearl Harbor, the war was being fought in silence. Cigarette smoke curled above desks covered in crumpled messages and endless sheets of numbers. Typewriters clacked like gunfire in the night. These were not soldiers with rifles, but codebreakers, men and women whose only weapons were pencils, patience, and the relentless pursuit of a single truth hidden inside Japanese ciphers. The unit was called FRUPAC, Fleet Radio Unit, Pacific. For months they had intercepted streams of enemy transmissions, each line a tangle of mystery, each code a wall between them and the future. Most days were routine, filled with fragments of meaningless chatter. But on the morning of April 14, 1943, one operator froze mid-typing. A string of coordinates, dates, and times appeared in the intercepted message, far too specific to ignore. Lieutenant Commander Layton, head of the intelligence section, leaned over the decoded fragments. His voice was barely above a whisper. "It's Yamamoto's schedule, his entire flight plan." The room fell silent. They all knew what that meant. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, the most revered officer in Japan's Imperial Navy, was about to fly a frontline inspection tour across the Solomon Islands. The message included every detail: departure time, route, altitude, even the type of plane he would use. It was the kind of intelligence gift that happened only once in a war. But it was also a curse. If America acted on it, the Japanese might discover their codes had been broken and change them overnight. That would erase years of work and blind the Allies in the Pacific. The weight of that choice pressed like a stone on every man in the room. Layton reported to Admiral Chester Nimitz, who listened in silence. The words hung in the air between them like an unspoken question. Do we strike, or do we stay silent? Nimitz finally said, "If the chance to shorten the war comes only once, we must take it." The order was sent up the chain, and within hours the debate reached Washington. President Franklin D. Roosevelt read the report with quiet gravity. According to accounts later whispered among naval staff, he uttered just one line: "Get Yamamoto." And so, the wheels of Operation Vengeance began to turn. Back in the Pacific, intelligence officers worked through the night. They mapped Yamamoto's route from Rabaul to Bougainville, noting the exact minute he would be airborne, 6:20 a.m. They calculated the range from the nearest Allied base on Guadalcanal, 435 miles, too far for most fighters except one, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. With twin engines and long-range tanks, it was the only aircraft capable of reaching the target and returning alive. Major John W. Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron was summoned under top secrecy. In a small briefing hut on Henderson Field, he was told the mission's core details: an intercept, a VIP target, no further questions. Only a handful of officers knew the truth. The rest were told simply that they were to strike a high-value target. Mitchell accepted the order without hesitation, though the tension in his jaw betrayed the weight he carried. As night fell, the base was shrouded in darkness. Mechanics worked by flashlight, bolting oversized fuel tanks beneath the wings of 18 P-38s. The humid air smelled of oil and fear. Pilots wrote short letters home, some addressed to wives, some to mothers, most unfinished. In another part of the Pacific, Yamamoto was also writing. His hand, firm yet weary, traced delicate lines of calligraphy, a farewell poem for his mistress, and a reminder that even warriors must face fate with dignity. He had no idea that his final journey had already been mapped by his enemies. The next morning, in the code room at Pearl Harbor, the operators waited. The men who had uncovered the message could only imagine the battle about to unfold hundreds of miles away. They would never see the flames, never hear the engines, but their work would change history. As the sun rose over Oahu, one of the cryptographers whispered to another, "Somewhere out. There, they're flying on our words." He wasn't wrong. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States was on the offensive, guided not by luck or chance, but by intellect and resolve. That single message, decrypted on April 14th, had turned into a death sentence for Japan's most celebrated admiral. Yet, in the quiet aftermath of the decision, a sense of unease lingered among the codebreakers. They knew their success would have to remain secret. No medals, no headlines, no acknowledgement. History would remember the pilots, but not the silent minds who had opened the door. In the long hours before dawn, Lieutenant Commander Layton stood at the window overlooking the dark sea. The lights of Honolulu flickered faintly in the distance. He whispered to himself, "We've won a battle no one will ever see." You can almost hear the ticking clock toward destiny, the calm before the engines roar to life. Outside, the waves of the Pacific rolled softly against the shore, unaware of the secret war fought in whispers and ink. In that fragile dawn, the men of FRUPAC did not cheer. They sat in silence, each one haunted by a thought they could not speak aloud, that behind every decoded line was a heartbeat soon to end. They had outsmarted an empire, but in doing so had condemned another human being to death. Duty had demanded it, but their hearts, heavy with exhaustion, knew the truth. Victory in World War II was never clean, and even the righteous carried the weight of what they had done. At first light on April 18, 1943, Henderson Field shimmered under the heat of the Pacific sun. The air was heavy with salt and dust, the kind that clung to skin and hope alike. 18 P-38, Lightning stood lined up on the pierced steel runway, their propellers glinting like blades. Mechanics tightened bolts with trembling hands. No one spoke much. Somewhere between the roar of engines and the silence of anticipation lay a truth they all understood. Some of these men would not come back. Major John W. Mitchell walked along the line of aircraft, his boots echoing on the steel. He looked into each cockpit. Boys barely out of college, faces too young for the burden they carried. None of them knew their real mission. "We're intercepting a high-value target," he had told them. That was all. The rest was swallowed by the wind. The P-38 Lightning was a strange bird, sleek, twin-engined, with a frame that shimmered silver in the morning haze. To the men who flew it, she was both guardian and gamble. The modifications for this mission, dual fuel tanks, one a giant 330-gallon drum, made the aircraft sluggish at takeoff, but promised just enough range to strike and return. Every man knew the numbers. Every man ignored them. At 07:10, Mitchell raised his hand. "Let's go." Engines thundered to life in unison. The sound tore through the humid air like an animal's roar. One by one, the Lightnings lifted off, skimming barely 50 feet above the ocean's surface. The horizon swallowed them whole. For the next 2 hours, they flew in absolute silence. No radio chatter, no navigation beacons, only compass headings, stopwatch timing, and blind faith. The Pacific stretched beneath them, endless blue, both beautiful and merciless. Each wave looked like a grave. Inside the cockpits, sweat ran down foreheads. The fuel gauges became lifelines. Every tick of the needle was a reminder that they were pushing the edge of possibility. Some pilots mouthed prayers, others clenched their jaws and stared into the glare of the rising sun. The hum of engines became a kind of heartbeat, steady, anxious, alive. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Admiral Yamamoto began his own morning ritual. He adjusted his white gloves, inspected his sword, and read quietly from a folded paper, a farewell poem written in the style of his ancestors. The body is frail, yet the spirit is strong. To his aides, he seemed calm, almost serene. None dared to remind him of the warnings, American fighters sighted nearby, rumors of ambush. He waved them off. A commander must share the dangers of his men. The words hung like prophecy. Back over the Pacific, Mitchell checked his watch, 9:27. The coastline of Bougainville appeared ahead, green and jagged. His calculations were perfect. They were 3 minutes early. He signaled the formation to climb. The lightnings began to rise through thin layers of mist, throttles forward, engines straining. At 9:34, someone shouted through the radio, "Bogies, 11 o'clock high!" 2 dark specks appeared on the horizon, followed by 6 smaller ones darting behind. 2 Betty bombers and 6 Zero fighters, exactly as intelligence had said. Mitchell's heart hammered. This was it. But there was a problem. There were 2 bombers, not 1. Which one carried Yamamoto, the lead or the trailing? There was no time to debate. The decision had to be made in seconds. Mitchell barked into his radio, "Drop tanks now!" The pilots released their auxiliary fuel tanks, which fell and splashed into the sea below. The sudden jolt lightened the aircraft, but for one pilot, the tank jammed. His plane lurched violently. "I'm out!" he shouted, forced to turn back. His wingman followed, leaving 16 Lightnings to complete the mission. The killer flight, 4 fighters led by Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber, pushed their throttles to the limit, climbing to intercept the bombers. The Zeros dove to defend. In seconds, the calm blue sky became chaos. Machine gun fire shredded the air. Silver streaks crossed with black smoke trails. Barber dove head-on toward the lead Betty. Bullets from the escorting Zeros ripped through his wings and fuselage. 104 holes would later be counted, but he didn't flinch. He squeezed the trigger. The P-38's nose. Guns erupted, spitting fire and lead. His rounds tore through the bomber's engines, and a moment later, flames burst from its right wing. Inside the Betty, Admiral Yamamoto gripped his sword as the cockpit filled with smoke. His aide turned, eyes wide. "Commander!" But it was too late. The aircraft shuddered, dipped, and spiraled down, vanishing beneath the jungle canopy. From the second bomber, Admiral Ugaki watched in horror. "Look at the commander's plane!" he shouted. It was the last time he saw Yamamoto alive. The Americans didn't celebrate. They were too busy trying to survive. Zeros swarmed the remaining P-38s. Lanphier turned sharply to meet them, his guns blazing. 1 Zero exploded mid-air, another clipped a wing and spiraled into the sea. Mitchell's voice crackled through static, "Get clear! Save your fuel!" The dogfight lasted barely 20 minutes, yet it felt like a lifetime. By the end, the sky was empty again. Smoke drifted above the jungle like a funeral banner. Mitchell checked his watch, 10:02. He turned his plane toward Guadalcanal. Fuel was running dangerously low. As the Lightnings limped home, the enormity of what they had done began to settle in. They had struck down Japan's greatest admiral, the man who had once terrified America, but the price of that victory was written in every scar on their aircraft and every gallon of fuel left in their tanks. Hours later, they landed one by one, engines sputtering, tanks nearly dry. When the last P-38 touched down, the ground crews rushed to help. Mitchell climbed out, drenched in sweat, his eyes hollow. "Did we get him?" someone asked. He paused for a long moment before answering. "Yes," he said quietly. "We got him." The sun was setting over Guadalcanal, painting the sky red and gold, the same colors that now burned over Bougainville. Somewhere beyond the jungle, Yamamoto's final prophecy had come true. For 6 months he could run wild. After that he could promise nothing. The war in the Pacific would never be the same again. The news reached Rabaul like a shadow moving across the sea. By late afternoon, Radio contact with Admiral Yamamoto's flight had vanished. At first, his aides dismissed it as interference, a temporary loss of signal. But as hours passed and no word came, anxiety turned into dread. A second bomber limped back, its fuselage riddled with holes, landing hard on the runway. Admiral Ugaki staggered out, pale, trembling. The commander's plane went down. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy fell silent. Messages were exchanged in coded whispers. No one dared to speak Yamamoto's name aloud. The official line was that his aircraft had disappeared due to enemy activity. But everyone in the Admiralty knew the truth. Japan's greatest admiral was gone. The search began at dawn. A team of soldiers cut their way through the jungle of Bougainville, following the column of smoke that still rose faintly through the trees. They found the wreckage scattered across the forest floor, twisted metal, burnt fragments, the unmistakable green of the Betty bomber's skin. In the middle of the debris sat a figure still strapped to his seat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was dead. His hands rested calmly on the armrests, his head tilted slightly to the side. A single bullet wound marked his jaw, another his shoulder. In his right hand, he still clutched the hilt of his ancestral samurai sword. The expression on his face was strangely peaceful, as if he had known this was how it would end. The men who found him bowed their heads. Some wept quietly. None spoke. They built a small altar beside the wreck. Flowers from the nearby trees were placed around the body. A soldier whispered a prayer. Another recited a haiku. For that brief moment, the war seemed to stop. The jungle held its breath. Even the birds went quiet. Back in Rabaul, when confirmation arrived, the base froze. Officers stood motionless as the report was read aloud. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, killed in action. Some refused to believe it. Others fell to their knees. For an entire month, Japan kept the secret. Newspapers printed nothing. Troops were told only that the admiral was on an extended mission, but whispers traveled faster than censorship. When the news finally broke on May 21st, 1943, the nation mourned as if an emperor had died. Schools closed, factories halted for silence. In Tokyo, women carried Yamamoto's portrait through the streets, framed in black cloth. Soldiers bowed their heads. Children placed white chrysanthemums along the roadsides. Even those who had begun to doubt the war wept openly. To them, Yamamoto had been more than a commander. He had been the soul of Japan's navy, the man who had humbled the West. His ashes were carried to Tokyo Bay, aboard the battleship Musashi, escorted by destroyers that once followed his command. At his funeral, the emperor himself offered incense. The sound of drums echoed through the hall, slow, deliberate, final. For Japan, it was not just a death, it was the moment the tide of destiny began to turn. In the United States, the mood was starkly different. News of the mission was kept under strict secrecy. The pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron were told not to speak, not even to their families. The official reports called it an interception of enemy aircraft. But within military circles, the truth spread quickly. The architect of Pearl Harbor had been killed. When the news reached Washington, there was no public celebration. President Roosevelt simply nodded when told. "Justice," he murmured, "but at a cost." For those who had fought through the hell of the Pacific, it felt like a silent redemption, a closing of a wound that had burned since December 7, 1941. Yet among the pilots, the feeling was far from triumph. Rex Barber and Thomas Lanphier, the two men credited with the kill, were haunted by it for years. They had done their duty, but at night they often saw the burning wreck in their dreams. "He was a soldier like us," Barber would later say. "He fought for his country the way we fought for ours. In another time, we might have shared a drink." In Pearl Harbor, the cryptographers of FRUPAC continued their work in silence. No medals, no headlines. They listened to new codes, broke new patterns, and moved on. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, one of them would pause and think about the man on the other end of that message. A man who once studied in Boston, who spoke English, who admired American industry and feared its power. The man they had helped to kill. War, they realized, was not only about nations or armies. It was about people, all fragile, all caught in something larger than themselves. Months later, As Allied ships advanced through the Pacific, the absence of Yamamoto was felt in every Japanese decision. His successor, Admiral Koga, lacked his strategic brilliance. The fleet grew cautious, reactive, and divided. Without Yamamoto's vision, Japan's naval supremacy began to unravel. The empire that once stretched across the Pacific was now shrinking under the relentless force of American production and air power. And yet, even in victory, the Americans carried the same unease as their enemy. Mitchell, now promoted, often avoided talking about the mission. When asked years later how he felt, he answered quietly, "We did our job, that's all. But sometimes, doing your job doesn't mean you sleep easy." History would remember the mission as Operation Vengeance, a bold strike, a symbol of precision and justice. But beneath the legend lay a truth more complicated, that in war, even righteous actions come with ghosts. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945 and World War II came to an end, the story of Yamamoto's death remained both a triumph and a tragedy. It proved that intelligence and courage could change the course of history, but also that no victory in war is ever truly clean. In the jungles of Bougainville, the wreck of Yamamoto's bomber still rests among the trees. The jungle has claimed it, vines wrapping around the metal like forgiving hands. Visitors who find it say the air grows still, as if time itself pauses to remember. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of engines fading into the distance, the last heartbeat of a man who tried to warn his country and of those who carried out the order that ended his life. The jungle grew quiet again, as if the earth itself had chosen to forget. Yet, history never truly sleeps. The wreckage of Yamamoto's plane, hidden beneath moss and time, became more than a monument. It was a question whispered across generations. What does victory mean when both sides lose a part of their soul? In the years that followed, survivors from both nations carried invisible scars. American pilots who once felt pride now spoke softly of guilt. Japanese sailors who once revered their admiral remembered the silence that followed his death more than his glory. Between them stretched an ocean, but also a shared grief, the kind only war can create. And as peace slowly returned to the Pacific, the world stood on the threshold of something new, a chance to learn, to rebuild, and to remember. History remembers names, medals, and victories. But history also forgets the sound of silence that comes after the engines stop. When the mission ended that April afternoon in 1943, and the Pacific winds swallowed the last echoes of gunfire, there was no cheering, no applause, only the faint hum of engines returning home and the quiet realization that something irreversible had just happened. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who once commanded fear, respect, and even reluctant admiration, was gone. The mastermind of Pearl Harbor had met his end not on a grand battlefield, but in the lonely canopy of a Pacific jungle. And with him fell more than a commander. An era, an idea, a nation's illusion of invincibility, all burned away in that single 20-minute dogfight. For Japan, the loss was spiritual. The news spread like a cold wind through the ranks of the Imperial Navy. Men who had worshipped Yamamoto's name now faced a hollow sky. Some refused to believe it. Others simply stared at their hands, realizing that even gods of war could bleed. For America, the feeling was different, yet not so distant. Pride mixed with unease. The enemy had been defeated, justice served, but beneath the surface there lingered an ache that no victory could soothe. The world would later call it Operation Vengeance. But for those who lived it, the mission was never about vengeance. It was about duty, that strange, relentless force that drives men to do what must be done, even when their hearts beg otherwise. After the war, decades later, when the names had turned to history and the medals to rust, a few of those who had been there spoke quietly of what they felt. Lieutenant Rex Barber, who fired the fatal shots, never glorified the act. "I did my job," he said simply. "I did what I was told, but I never hated him." And perhaps that was the truest victory, to kill without hatred, to survive without pride. In another time, another life, Yamamoto might have been a friend to those who killed him. He had studied in America, spoken English fluently, admired the discipline and energy of the West. He had warned his superiors that Japan could never win a long war against the United States. For 6 months, he had said, I can run wild. After that, I can promise nothing. His prophecy became his epitaph. When the wreckage of his plane was found, his hands were still on the armrests, his sword still in his grip. His eyes were closed, as if he had merely fallen asleep. The soldiers who found him bowed their heads. In that moment, even his enemies might have felt the same, not triumph, but sorrow. Because deep down, they all understood the same truth. War takes everything, even from those who seem to win. The years that followed would prove Yamamoto right. The empire he helped build crumbled beneath the weight of its own ambition. The Pacific burned, and millions, Japanese, American, Chinese, Filipino, Australian, would pay for the decisions of men they never met. World War II became not just a struggle between nations, but a mirror held up to humanity's soul. It showed us how far we would go for pride and how much we would lose in return. And yet, amid the fire and ruin, something else survived, something quieter, stronger, more enduring than vengeance. In the ashes of war, the same nations that had once tried to destroy each other began to build. The same hands that forged weapons began to build homes, schools, cities, peace. That is the paradox of World War II. Out of the greatest darkness came an understanding of what light truly means. In the years after the war, American veterans who had fought in the Pacific often traveled back, not to conquer, but to remember. Some visited the jungles of Bougainville, where Yamamoto's wreck still lies beneath moss and roots. They stood before the rusted skeleton of his plane, listening to the silence, feeling something they could not name. One veteran placed an American flag next to a small Japanese shrine that locals had built there. Enemies once, he said softly, brothers now. The jungle did not judge. It simply grew around the wreck, its vines wrapping gently around the twisted metal like forgiving hands. Time, indifferent but merciful, covered the scars of war in green. When you look at the faces of those who lived through it, the codebreakers hunched over their machines, the pilots who flew into death, the families who waited by radios, you begin to see what victory really costs. It's not measured in battles won or enemies lost, but in the moments of humanity that survived despite it all. A letter never sent, a photograph kept in a flight jacket, a prayer whispered for an enemy's soul. Today, we live in a world built on the ruins of their courage. The peace we take for granted was not a gift. It was bought piece by people who understood the true price of war. And as the generations who fought World War II fade into memory, their stories become more than history. They become warnings. Because war, at its core, is never about nations. It is about people, ordinary men and women swept into extraordinary circumstances, each carrying the same fragile hope, that one day their children would live in a world where no one needed to fight. So, as we remember the flight of the 18, the brilliance of the codebreakers, and the death of the admiral who tried to warn his own country, we must also remember what came after. Not the parades, not the flags, but the silence, the heavy, necessary silence that reminds us why peace matters. And when we teach these stories, we must teach them not as tales of glory, but as lessons in humility. Because the real victory of World War II was not found in the battlefield, but in the forgiveness that followed it, in the handshakes between former enemies, in the children of America and Japan who would one day study side by side, unaware that their grandfathers once aimed guns at each other across the same ocean. That is what makes history sacred. It reminds us that every act of courage, every tragedy, every loss leads us back to the same truth. Humanity endures. So, the next time you see the still waters of the Pacific or the rusted bones of a forgotten airplane resting beneath the trees, remember what they stand for. Not just for those who died, but for those who chose to live differently afterward. Because the story of Operation Vengeance is not only about a mission, it's about the fragile, eternal balance between duty and mercy, between vengeance and understanding. It's about the voices that still whisper through history, urging us to listen, to learn, and to do better. In the end, war is not a story of winners and losers. It is a story of survivors, of what they carry and of what they choose to lay down. And that is why, across time and across oceans, one message remains the same. We must always fight for peace. Because peace is not a destination, it is a choice, renewed each day by those who remember. The men who fought in that distant sky are gone now, but their echoes remain in the calm of every dawn, in the quiet freedom we so easily forget. Each sunrise over the Pacific carries their unspoken promise that courage must never serve hatred, and that memory must always serve peace. So when the world grows restless again, and voices of division rise, listen for the hum of those old engines, reminding us what it truly means to fight for peace.